I'm in the browser, and here's my local host, and I have some files in a folder. You can see them here. I have several HTML forms that are all processed by a PHP script. I would like to show you the different ways that you can retrieve the values from a form. Here we have the same form that we've looked at before. However, I'm only going to be working with the first name and the email address. So for every HTML file, the action is being processed by a PHP file, meaning we will send the name value pairs to that file and we can retrieve them and echo back some information about them. Here is the PHP file that is processing my first form. You can see it is a normal HTML document. However, inside the body, I have some embedded PHP. Here I have my opening delimiter and echo statement. $_post. This is a server variable, which is actually an associative array. It holds all the name value pairs of the form. Because it is an associative array, the name value pairs are called key value pairs. It doesn't matter, it's the same thing. So if I know the name of a form element and it is being processed by a post as the method, this expression here will return the value. All I'm doing here is concatenating a carriage return and a break for my view source. All right, so I'm saying welcome, all right, whoever your first name is, and then I'm saying your email address, whatever your email is. So $_post. There is also a $_get for method equals get. If I fill in the form and I send the data, there we are. Notice the action. We have now loaded a totally new page. If I look at the view source, you do not see PHP. However, it's not that wonderful. It needs a little bit of work. Sometimes it's very hard to line up the spaces. There's my break, and this goes down to the next line. Let's take a look at Form 2. It's exactly the same, and this is being processed by Form 2. You want to start thinking about error checking. Even though you're creating the form, and you know the method equals post, and you know that you're using $_post, you want to make sure. All right, so you might see some people doing this. And this is the server super global variable. And there are many values that it can return. One of them is the request method. It will either return post or get depending on what the request is. So here we have a little bit of error checking. And I realize we have not looked at conditional statements yet, but you should be familiar with a basic structure of an if. Okay, so once we have verified that indeed we have a post, now it's a little bit cleaner to store these values in variables, and I'm also going to set up a variable for my HTML break and my carriage returns. I am going to put the whole message in a variable. However, supposing there's a problem, I can echo out there is a problem in my else, and then I can execute the die function. Die essentially exits out of the script. We have two functions that pretty much do the same thing. In my PHP document here's essentially where my message is going to be. So the message is either going to be there is a problem, or it's going to be your name. There we go. Okay, let's look at form number 3. Another common way of making sure that you are sending over data with your post is to either give your submit button a value or to have a hidden field and to check for its existence. In our HTML file, we had the hidden field and I set it to a value. You will see this isSet function being used a lot in forms. What that is saying, it's checking to see that this name has a value, that a value has been set for this name, which represents a form element. So if it does have a value, then we will proceed. So here again, this is another way of executing the code only if the form has been submitted. If the form hasn't been submitted properly, then we're not going to execute the code. Now, let's go back to our browser for a minute. Supposing I were to just load my form3.php. Notice there is a problem. Why? Because this file was not executed from a form. It was just loaded in midair. And there are times when you don't want someone accessing a PHP file in and of itself. That file has to be called from the form. Let's go back and see how we did that. Here's our if statement. If is set. We're checking to see if that value is there. There's else. There is a problem. So therefore, we're not going to execute any code because this file was not called from this form, which had this hidden field sending over a value. Now, what happens if I just click send data? All right, it says welcome. It doesn't say anything else. Why? Because I didn't have values. We will revisit forms and learn more about validating in the future. But for now, we do not want to echo back anything unless we have these values. So how do we do that? Inside our outer if, we will check to see if the values are not empty using another if. Here we have the empty function, and it takes a value. And this is our value, $post_f_name. So we have a compound condition here. We're looking to make sure that both of these fields are not empty. If they are both not empty, then we will store the values in the variables and set the message. Else it will just say welcome. Okay, the same form again. Let's take a look at the PHP file. We're using our isSet function, making sure that this file was called when this form was submitted. And we have the same routine that we did in the previous, the number 3 form, except that rather than using $post, we're using the filter input function. And it takes 2 values, input post, comma, the name of the field that we're checking. So we can use filter_input also. This is shown in the book. I personally like $_post the best. Number 1, it's shorter, less code to write. Number 2, you see this more out there in the documentation. However, this function you can use to return a value. And here again, we're using not empty. You may also see people posting the form to itself. Here in my action, I am dynamically generating the action. Notice I have embedded PHP inside my opening form tag as the value of my action attribute. $_server, here again, this is the super global variable, and it returns values for many different keys here. PHP_self is the file that is open, and it will return the name of that file. And we always use echo because echo writes it out. So when we click the submit button, the form will be posted to itself. This is a commonly used procedure, and it's commonly used sometimes in form validation, so you can write right to the page rather than having the user go back and forth. We also have where our message is going to be displayed, and I have my placeholder here for my variable. The first time this page loads, it's going to read from the top down. And if I don't have this variable initialized set to nothing, it's going to be a variable without a value, and we will get an error message. All right, so we only want to execute this code if the user, again, has submitted the form. We don't want this being read when the page loads, because at that point there are no values. So here we have our if statement, and there's our $server request method equals post. We're checking. Okay, so only if this returns true do we want to store values in our variables. Actually, you could have put that on the top. That doesn't really matter. And now we're using the filter input. We're checking to see, just like we did in the other one, and we have a couple messages. So if I don't have any data and I click send, we'll only say welcome visitor. Once I put the data in, there we are. But notice, when the form is sent, it loses the values. We can see that it retrieved them, but we're essentially refreshing the page, and there are no more values here. In a real-life situation, you might want to retain those values in these fields. How do you do that? I have another file, form self2, which shows how to do that. So here's our form. It's the same as the other one. There's our message placeholder. There is our action. However, what I have in my text box here, I have actually coded in a value. Similar to coding in a value for my action, right inside the element. And here I'm echoing the value of $first name. This is how you persist data in form fields using PHP. I'm doing the same for my email. I'm coding in a value. By default, the value initially is set to nothing. And then whatever the user types in, it is sent to the server. However, when you return to the form, the value essentially by default is set to nothing. So what we do, here again, we need to initialize these variables or we will get an error message when the page loads. So they're all set to empty. So by default, the values of those two form elements are set to nothing. Here again, we're looking to make sure that we did indeed use a post to send this. And now we're checking. The only thing that has changed here from the previous file is that we have added our PHP expressions into our value. So now, there's my name, there's my email, there we are here. If I right click and look at the source code, here's the action of my form. Notice. And on a web server, you'll notice that that essentially is referring to the root. That means that this is in the root, which indeed it is. This / in a path does not work in a browser. It only works when you're running on a web server. Here's my value equals Teresa. And here's my value equals tpelkie@gmail. Please don't email me there. So you can see here in the view source that the PHP has dynamically sent back HTML to the browser. So you can also open these, put this folder somewhere in localhost, as I have, and you can click on the HTMLs and the PHPs, and you can look to and play with it to understand the various ways of retrieving form data.